Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are immersing ourselves in, well, a really profound piece of revolutionary history. It's as complex intellectually as it is dramatic historically.
That's right.
We're diving into the core philosophy of Bhagat Singh, who was, of course, one of India's most significant anti-colonial figures. Specifically, we're looking at his legendary essay, Why I Am an Atheist.
And this is quite a rare opportunity for a deep dive, wouldn't you say? Because the source material itself is essentially a final testament.
Exactly.
Singh wrote this while he was incarcerated, facing execution. And it really goes far beyond just a simple political statement. It's this meticulous, really structured philosophical defense. You have a man articulating precisely why, even in the shadow of the gallows, he just couldn't turn to God. He weaves together his personal history, some rigorous logic, and a pretty radical sociological critique of faith itself.
So our mission today is really to understand not just what Singh believed, but maybe more importantly, how he arrived at this quite extreme skepticism. We want to detail the logical steps he took, to dismantle faith.
Yeah.
And the essay begins, maybe surprisingly for some, not directly with God, but with the challenge to his own character.
That's the essential starting point, isn't it? He opens by directly addressing this core accusation that was leveled against him, by friends, family, political critics.
Right.
The idea that his lack of belief was simply a consequence of arrogant pride and vanity.
Kind of dismissing it.
Exactly. Dismissing his atheism as just a personality flaw, not a conclusion he'd reasoned his way to. And Singh absolutely refuses to accept that framing. That refusal really sets the stage for what becomes a devastating intellectual counterattack.
Well, okay, let's unpack this opening defense then, because this charge, this vanity charge, it was deeply tied to his sudden, almost overwhelming public recognition, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. Singh had been involved in revolutionary activities for years, but it was really after the high-profile Delhi bombing and then the Lahore conspiracy case that his notoriety it rocketed, as he said.
Right.
And his peers, or at least some of them, suggested that this fame had basically turned his head, convinced him he was somehow beyond needing any divine authority. And that's precisely what he challenges right away. He uses a simple, factual correction rooted in his own personal timeline.
Okay.
He asserts very plainly that his atheism actually came before his celebrity. He insists he was already an atheist when he was just an unknown figure, a college student.
Nobody knew him.
Exactly. A time when, as he rightly points out, a young person doesn't really have the status to cherish any sort of exaggerated notion of himself that may lead him to atheism.
Interesting point.
So this establishes right off the bat that the intellectual framework, the atheism, it was built during his obscurity, not fueled by some leader ego trip from success.
What I find really insightful, though, is how honest he is about his own flaws. He doesn't pretend he has no pride at all.
No, he doesn't. It's quite remarkable.
He admits he has a weakness for it. He even mentions his friends sometimes call him a dictator or a boaster.
Yeah.
And that he sometimes forced others to accept his opinion. He calls it vainglory. For someone in his position making a last stand, that level of self-awareness is, well, it's striking.
It really is. And it's almost certainly a deliberate rhetorical strategy. He's drawing a clear line, you see, between common human personal faults, maybe being a bit too opinionated or bossy, like you said, and the source of his profound, reasoned philosophical conclusion. The main argument he needs to take down is this idea that his rejection of God comes from some unnecessary pride aimed at making himself seem supreme.
Right.
It's essentially saying, look, yes, I have my faults, who doesn't? But my atheism isn't one of them. It's an intellectual position I arrived at through reason.
So to properly refute the charge, he then has to define what real philosophical pride would look like in a religious context. What does he say someone filled with that kind of divine vanity would actually do?
He draws a very sharp distinction there. He argues that true religious vanity, that kind of pride, is shown by someone who claims superiority by, say, deeming himself a god, or maybe a demigod or a prophet.
Okay.
Such a person, he points out, isn't actually a true atheist at all. They are, in fact, affirming the existence of supernatural power. They're just claiming a special privileged link to it, or maybe trying to take its place on Earth.
And Singh's stance is the complete opposite of that.
Precisely. Diametrically opposed. Singh states his definitive, total rejection. He's not interested in usurping the divine or claiming a special connection. He says he totally rejects the existence of an omnipresent, all-powerful, all-knowing God.
What a rejection.
Therefore, his atheism cannot possibly stem from arrogance aimed at self-deification, because in his view, there's no divine being to deify himself against in the first place. His rejection is complete, it's intellectual, it's structural.
That reframing is really powerful, isn't it? He almost turns the accusation back onto the believer.
In a way, yes.
It's like he's saying, if you can't rationally argue against my points about God, then just calling my disbelief pride is kind of an easy way out. It avoids engaging with the actual intellectual challenge he's putting forward.
Exactly. It clears the air, clears the slate for the listener, really. It allows us to move past the character assessment and get into the substance, the evidence of his intellectual journey.
So where did this intellectual journey actually begin? It's pretty crucial to understand, as you hinted, that Singh wasn't raised in some kind of secular vacuum. His upbringing was deeply religious.
Oh, absolutely. Foundational. Even though his father was apparently known for being tolerant in his religious views, he wasn't an atheist himself. Singh describes his younger self as a staunch believer during his elementary school days.
Staunch believer.
Yeah. He talks about living with his father, attending DAV College in Lahore. He specifically mentions living in a boarding house there and actively participating in the devotional life, sitting for prayers, chanting religious mantras, morning and evening.
And he identifies himself specifically, what was the term?
As a staunch Arya Samaji.
Okay, for listeners who might not be familiar with that specific historical context, what does being a staunch Arya Samaji really signify back then?
Well, it's important because it wasn't just about passive faith. The Arya Samaj was a significant reformist movement within Hinduism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were quite active, they rejected idolatry, they pushed for what they saw as a return to the purity of the Vedas. And importantly, the movement encouraged intellectual inquiry and social action.
Including anti-colonialism.
Yes, very much so. So the point is, even his early religious life wasn't one of just blind superstition. It was a kind of thinking devotion, if you like.
And that intellectual grounding, ironically perhaps, likely prepared him for the later, more radical skepticism he developed.
But the skepticism didn't just appear overnight. It sounds like it was more of a slow burn, a gradual erosion of belief.
Definitely.
He notes the seeds of doubt were planted when he got into National College, during the non-cooperation movement days. That's when he started thinking over all the religious polemics, as he puts it.
Yes, the intellectual questioning began there. But, it didn't immediately just wipe out decades of cultural and emotional conditioning.
Sure.
Despite this growing skepticism, he says his belief in God remained firm and strong for quite a while after that. He even kept up the Sikh religious custom of growing a beard and kais the long head hair.
Right.
Maintaining that religious identity, even while his mind was starting to question the core beliefs, really illustrates the huge cultural and, emotional weight attached to faith back then. It wasn't something you could just easily discard.
And this internal conflict he was experiencing, it seems it was mirrored within the Revolutionary Party he joined. That's a great point.
He notes that, at least initially, the party itself didn't really have the courage to openly declare atheism.
No, they didn't.
The first leader he met basically gave an out, didn't he? Saying something like, you can believe in him when you feel like it.
Yeah, exactly. It shows you here was a movement willing to fight the British Empire, but not quite ready collectively to take on God.
That hesitation is really instructive. Singh goes into some detail about Comrade Sakindra Nath Sanyal, a very famous leader who was sentenced to life imprisonment. His book, Bandi Jivan, Life of a Prisoner, was apparently a key text for revolutionaries.
Absolutely foundational. And Singh points out that Sanyal's book is just filled with praises of God, with mysticism. Singh even acknowledges that the party's main leaflet at the time, the revolutionary leaflet that was distributed widely, was basically Sanyal's intellectual work, and it included a whole paragraph dedicated to praising God.
So you see this really stark contrast emerging. The very foundation of the movement seems rooted in a kind of spiritual justification for their revolutionary actions.
Yeah.
Maybe hoping for divine help or, a glorious reward in the afterlife.
Precisely. Even figures we now see as icons, like Ram Prasad Bismal, one of the famous Kakori martyrs, Singh describes them as staunch believers, often passing their last day in prayers.
Wow.
So for Singh to consciously pivot away from that kind of spiritualized martyrdom, well, it required immense intellectual courage and conviction, too, because he knew he was separating himself from what was likely his comrade's deepest source of comfort and meaning.
So when did the definitive shift happen? When did he make that hard pivot from, let's say, quiet skepticism to an open declaration of atheism and this embrace of realism?
Singh pinpoints it very precisely. The end of 1926. That's the moment.
Okay.
This is where he looks back and diagnoses that earlier phase of revolutionary activity as being dominated by romance and mysticism.
Right, not realism.
Not realism. He felt this incessant desire to study, he says, and to approach the revolution in a more serious manner, and this led to a radical change in their ideology. The new approach became no more mysticism, no more blind faith. Now realism was our mode of thinking.
That's a clear line in the sand.
Absolutely. That was the moment he fully committed to a materialist worldview.
And the source material, his essay, is very explicit about the specific philosophical fuel for this realism, isn't it? It came from anti-theist political philosophy.
Yes, and this is where we get into the real density of his thought. His studies, he tells us, were concentrated on anarchist and socialist thinkers, people like Bakunin, Marx, Lenin, Trotsky.
The heavy hitters.
The heavy hitters, exactly. And he explicitly states that all of them were atheists. Now, that's not just a coincidence. Their political ideologies were, structurally opposed to religion as an organizing principle for society.
Do you expand on that? How did their specific kind of atheism connect to Singh's political goals?
Well, take Marx, the father of communism. His famous line that religion is the opium of the masses is absolutely key here.
Right.
Marx argued that religion provided a kind of comfort, but it was a comfort that ultimately distracted the exploited masses from the real need for material change in this world. By giving them hope for heaven later, it helped them accept their miserable conditions now.
So it dulled the revolutionary impulse.
Exactly. Singh absorbed this idea. If you want a genuine revolution, you have to remove the opiate first.
And what about Bakunin, the anarchist influence you mentioned?
Bakunin was fiercely anti-authoritarian across the board. His famous quote, something like, "If God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him," perfectly captures that revolutionary spirit that must have resonated deeply with Singh.
Why abolish him?
Because for Bakunin, God represented the ultimate form of abstract authority, and therefore, God was the ultimate obstacle to true human freedom and self-determination. You couldn't be truly free if you were subservient, even to a divine power.
Makes sense from an anarchist perspective.
So, by the end of 1926, through all this intensive reading and thinking, Singh says he was convinced that the belief in an almighty supreme being simply had no sound foundations. His personal journey was complete. Intellectual discovery had finally overcome religious tradition.
Okay, so having detailed his own intellectual conversion to this realist viewpoint, Singh then moves into a more formal attack, an attack on the concepts of God and faith themselves.
Yes, the philosophical core.
He declares reason with a capital R almost to be the guiding principle of his life. He advocates for challenging absolutely all tenets of old beliefs with rigorous reasoning to see if they actually hold up.
His commitment to reason is total at this point. He sees blind belief not just as illogical, but as actively disastrous. He does acknowledge that philosophy itself, the attempt to find answers where we lack concrete scientific proof, often arises from human weakness. We want answers, we want certainty. But then he immediately highlights the fundamental problem with relying on faith for those answers. If you have all these different religious creeds he mentions, Oriental versus Occidental philosophies, Muslim versus Hindu beliefs, even internal conflicts within Hinduism, like Arya Samaj versus Sanatan Dharam.
Right, all claiming truth.
All claiming divine truth, yet they're often fundamentally opposed to each other. How can any single claim be accepted purely on faith when they contradict each other so profoundly? For Singh, that internal contradiction just destroys the credibility of the whole faith-based approach.
And this deep skepticism then leads him to deploy his most powerful philosophical weapon, which is the classic problem of evil, or as philosophers call it, the problem of
theodicy.
Theodicy.
Right.
That's it. Theodicy is basically the philosophical attempt to square the circle. How can you reconcile the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God with the sheer amount of evil and suffering we see in the world?
And Singh poses some really tough questions here. Devastating questions, really. He challenges this reconciliation head-on. The first big one is, if God is supposedly almighty, omnipresent, and omniscient, why did he create a world that's so full of woe and grief and countless miseries where not even one person lives in peace?
It's a direct hit on the idea of divine goodness, divine benevolence. He doesn't allow for easy answers either. He demands a justification for why a perfect creator would permit, millions of people dying of hunger in slums and huts, dirtier than the grim dungeons of prisons.
Exactly. The sheer scale of suffering, particularly suffering that seems completely unearned and undeserved. For Singh, that's perhaps the single greatest piece of evidence against the existence of a powerful, caring God.
His second question is just as tough, moving from general suffering to specific historical atrocities.
Yes. He asks, why didn't this omnipotent God intervene to stop historical figures known for immense cruelty? He names Nero, Genghis Khan, people who brought unimaginable misery to vast numbers. If God has the power to instill goodness, Singh challenges, why didn't he just infuse some humanistic sentiments into these tyrants to prevent their terrible acts?
The implication is pretty clear.
Yeah.
If God is all-powerful, then either he's malevolent for allowing such cruelty, or he's actually impotent because he was unable to stop it. Neither option fits the traditional definition of God.
Precisely. And the common theological response is often, well, you have to wait for the hereafter. Justice will be done then. The wicked will be punished.
Right. It all balances out in the end argument.
And Singh just rejects that outright. He sees it as a morally flimsy justification for enduring injustice now. He asks very scathingly, if you're only going to punish the evildoer later, how far will you justify your all-powerful, eternal Nero, who every day, every moment continues his pastime of killing people?
Yeah.
If the suffering is happening now, the promise of some future punishment is basically irrelevant to the people being oppressed today. It doesn't help them.
This critique then flows naturally into challenging the traditional justifications for punishment itself. He briefly touches on the main theories: retribution, deterrence, and reform.
He does. And significantly, he only accepts one of them as having real merit.
Move on.
He dismisses retribution, punishing purely for past wrongs, and deterrence, punishing one person to scare others as either insufficient or potentially cruel. The only theory he accepts as genuinely necessary for human progress is the reformative theory.
The idea that punishment should aim to improve the offender.
Exactly. To reform them, to change them. Now, why is this important in his argument? Because it grounds the whole moral basis for justice entirely in human potential for change and improvement, rather than in some abstract concept of divine wrath or balancing cosmic scales.
It keeps the focus firmly on the material world and human action.
Precisely, and that commitment to human action and material reality leads him directly to reject traditional doctrines like fate or karma or reincarnation.
Right, he takes on the idea of transmigration.
Yes, the doctrine often linked to texts like the Puranas. The idea that suffering in this life may be being born into poverty or with a disability, blind or lame, is simply your just deserts for sins you committed in a previous birth.
And he doesn't mince words about that idea.
No, he calls it tomfoolery and a fairy tale. Intellectual laziness, basically. He points out the obvious absurdity. Nobody has ever actually provided any concrete proof of such a previous birth. It's pure assertion.
So instead of that supernatural explanation, he offers a very concrete, materialist alternative for why people suffer or are born with defects.
He does. He argues that things like birth defects aren't some kind of moral payback. They are, in his view, a mere biological phenomenon. They relate to nature, to evolution, to heredity.
And he points towards science for the real answers.
Critically, yes. This is where he explicitly directs the reader towards Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. He says that's where you'll find a satisfactory scientific explanation for these things.
That reference is key, isn't it?
It's absolutely key. It showcases his ultimate commitment to realism. He's rejecting supernatural explanations for human fate and suffering, and instead embracing scientific, biological, material causality. Because, as he implies, you can't effectively fight an enemy or change your condition if you believe it was all predetermined by something you did in a past life you can't even remember.
Okay, so once he feels he's demolished the philosophical underpinnings of God, Singh moves smoothly into the sociological realm. How does faith actually function in society? He starts by arguing that the concept of God itself is basically a human invention, born out of our own sense of weakness.
That's his starting point for the sociology of it, yes. Singh suggests that humans only created God in their imagination when they first became really conscious of their own weaknesses, limitations, and shortcomings. God, in this view, became necessary almost as a universal phenomenon because it provided a vital source of courage and, maybe more importantly, consolation when facing distress.
Like a coping mechanism.
Exactly. When you're faced with things you can't comprehend or control, natural disasters, immense personal tragedy, It's psychologically easier to navigate if you can believe there's some higher power in charge, some grand plan. He even suggests belief in ghosts and evil spirits evolves into belief in God for similar reasons.
So he sees God initially as a kind of spiritual crutch, something that helped early humans cope.
Yeah.
But he quickly argues he didn't stay that simple or innocent.
No, not at all. He blames what he calls the ingenuity of exploiters for transforming this psychological crutch into a powerful tool of social control.
And this is the core revolutionary critique coming through again.
Absolutely. Singh argues that those in power, the exploiters, needed something to legitimize their privileged positions. They needed sanction, they needed authority, and religion became the perfect instrument for that.
How so?
By supporting tyrannical and exploiting institutions, men, and classes. If you can link the existing social order, the status quo, to the will of God, then the elite's power seems divinely ordained, unchallengeable.
This is the practical application of that opiate of the masses idea we talked about earlier. He actually defines the key players involved in maintaining this system of control.
He does. He calls it a dirty alliance between religious preachers and possessors of power.
A dirty alliance, strong word.
Very strong. And this alliance, he argues, brought humanity the boon, and he uses that word sarcastically, of course, the boon of prisons, gallows, knouts, and all the philosophical theories designed to justify oppression.
So doctrines like transmigration, which he already dismissed philosophically, also become convenient political tools in this view.
Precisely. Think about it. If you're suffering from crushing poverty or facing terrible abuse, and the religious explanation is that it's your fault because of sins in a previous life,
then you're less likely to blame the landlord or the ruler.
Exactly. It deflects blame from the ruling class. And conversely, the exploiters themselves could be painted as godly people whose power and wealth were simply divinely sanctioned rewards, justifying the resources they'd accumulated, often through exploitation.
He then connects this abstract sociological critique very directly, very urgently, to the political struggle happening right then in India under British rule. He asks what seems like the ultimate political question for a believer at that time. Why doesn't God just force the British to leave India?
And his answer is incredibly sharp, and it's rooted entirely in material reality, not theology. British rule, he declares, is not God-willed.
Okay.
It persists, he argues, not because of some divine plan, but simply due to the lack of will and courage to oppose it among the Indian people themselves, fueled by their own apathy. He completely rejects the idea that any foreign power's rule is divinely ordained.
That's a really powerful critique of political complacency, especially when it's disguised as religious piety. He specifically criticizes those who might see the theoretical benefits of something like socialism, which promises material equality, but then they refuse to actually act on it, saying, oh, God will sort things out eventually.
Singh just cuts right through that kind of passivity. He states very clearly, the British are keeping India subjugated not with God's consent, but with the force of guns and rifles, bombs and bullets, police and militia.
The material tools of power.
Material tools. And crucially, he adds, they rule with the complicity born from the apathy of the very people they govern. So his logic is clear. If the problem is material guns, apathy, then the solution must also be material courage, action.
The ultimate ideological stance here, then, reflecting his readings of Marx and Bakunin, seems to be that human progress depends entirely on humanity's struggle to dominate nature, to overcome material obstacles. There's no conscious power behind it.
That's the bedrock of his realism.
So if you truly accept that materialist reality, what does that make the act of prayer in the face of oppression?
It makes prayer, in his stark phrasing, the most degraded act on the part of man.
Degraded? Why degraded?
Because, from his perspective, if you want to be realistic, if you're truly committed to the cause of freedom, you must throw faith aside. You have to face your adversaries directly with courage and valor. Praying, in this context, becomes self-degradation because it's an admission of personal failure or helplessness. It shifts the responsibility away from human agency, away from collective revolutionary action, onto some imagined external power.
So if you have real courage...
If you have real courage, you don't need God to fight your battles for you. You stand up on your own 2 feet, rely on your own strength and the strength of your comrades, and you fight. #tagoutro.
And this brings us back, doesn't it, full circle, to the extraordinary context. The fact that Singh wrote this entire detailed, forceful argument while he was literally standing on the precipice of execution.
Absolutely.
The essay isn't just philosophy. It's above all this incredible testament to the absolute strength of his rational convictions, right there in that final terrifying hour. He utterly refused to give his critics the satisfaction of seeing him break, of seeing him return to faith for comfort.
His resolve was clearly tested right up until the very end. He recounts in the essay how his friends predicted, almost confidently, that he would eventually pray in his last days.
The pressure must have been immense.
Immense, but Singh recalls his firm reply, "No, dear sir, never shall it happen." For him, praying at that specific moment would have represented the ultimate degradation and demoralization. It would have been an admission that his entire intellectual framework, everything he'd reasoned his way to, had just collapsed under the weight of fear. He was absolutely determined not to seek that opiate to meet my end, as he put it.
And this final refusal, this final stand, it's perhaps the purest expression of his philosophical atheism, isn't it? It's a total rejection of the idea of a heavenly reward.
It really is.
He explicitly acknowledges that a believer, whether they're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, they have something potentially magnificent to look forward to. The chance to be reborn as a king, or the absolute certainty of paradise after death.
And Singh contrasts that sharply with his own motivation. He states very clearly that his devotion, his life's work, is disinterestedly dedicated. It's entirely focused on the cause of freedom, on serving humanity, on liberating people from suffering and oppression in this world.
Right.
He emphasizes again and again that he has absolutely no selfish motive of getting any reward here or in the hereafter. He's acting, he claims, purely for the benefit of others, knowing full well that his own personal annihilation is just days or hours away.
His reward, as he starkly defines it, is simply the short life of struggle with no such magnificent end. That's it.
That's it. He confirms his choice was to wage a war against their oppressors, tyrants, or exploiters, not for any personal gain like becoming a king or getting into heaven, but purely to try and establish liberty and peace for those who would come after him. The moment the rope tightens around his neck, he accepts will be the moment of utter annihilation for him personally.
So we circle back one last time to that initial charge he faced, pride. Here's a man who spent his life fighting for others, who explicitly rejected the ultimate form of self-interest, the salvation of his own individual soul, choosing instead collective action for material change. If a person sacrifices literally everything, including any hope for an afterlife, purely for the betterment of society and the liberation of the oppressed,
then how do we accurately label that? That's the question Singh leaves us with, implicitly. How should we define the limits of true selflessness?
it really raises that final provocative thought for you, the listener, to grapple with. Is this kind of commitment, the commitment to fight purely for material justice in this world without any expectation of spiritual reward or eternal glory, is that the ultimate demonstration of human pride? Or could it be argued that it's actually the highest, most rigorous expression of reasoned courage and selfless dedication?
A profound challenge indeed, to all our assumptions about faith, motivation, and sacrifice. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the intellectual legacy and the powerful final testament of Bhagat Singh.